Something is rotting inside the music industry, and the smell finally hit the timeline this week. Not a leak, not a diss, not a feud. Something far uglier. A crack in the foundation that the biggest label on earth has been patching with duct tape and press releases for over a decade. And the moment Drake pressed upload on his Iceman project, that crack split wide open in front of millions of people who had no idea what they were actually watching. They thought they were witnessing a sabotage. They thought they were uncovering a conspiracy. They thought they had stumbled onto the smoking gun that proved Universal Music Group was secretly trying to bury its own golden goose. But the real story buried underneath all that noise is darker, colder, and more revealing than anything the Stand Army could have imagined. And by the time you finish hearing this, you will never look at a streaming number the same way again. Let me drag you straight into the chaos, because what is unfolding right now on social media is not a normal album rollout. It is a public meltdown disguised as fan devotion. Drake drops the project. The fanbase erupts. Clips fly across timelines at lightning speed. Full audio rips. Music video frames. Entire song uploads passed around like contraband at a high school party. And then, almost instantly, the takedown notices begin falling from the sky like rain in a horror movie. DMCA after DMCA. Account after account. Post after post. Vanishing in real time. And instead of pausing for one breath to ask why this is happening, the loudest voices in the room reach for the most cinematic explanation possible. Universal is the villain. Iceman is the target. Drake is being silenced from the inside. The story practically writes itself. There is only one inconvenient detail standing in its way. None of it is true. Here's the part that the conspiracy crowd refuses to touch, because touching it would burn the entire theory to ash. Twitter, or X, or whatever rebrand it limps through next month, has no licensing agreement with the major labels. No deal. No pipeline. No revenue split. No mechanism, no contract, no agreement that allows Universal to collect a single coin when Drake's music plays inside someone's tweet. So when a random fan with 50,000 followers uploads a clean rip of a brand new Iceman cut, that playback generates exactly $0 for the label, $0 for the producers behind the boards, $0 for the writers who shaped the hooks, and $0 for Drake himself. Universal is not striking these posts to mute anyone. They're striking them because every play that happens on a platform with no licensing deal is a play that should have happened somewhere that actually pays. That is not sabotage. That is bookkeeping. And bookkeeping does not care about your feelings. Yet the noise keeps building, louder and uglier by the hour. The Iceman truthers are stacking theories on top of theories like a Jenga tower made of paranoia. One faction insists Universal is deliberately tanking Drake's numbers so a competing label can swoop in at a discount. Another faction is convinced the label is punishing him for some imaginary courtroom drama nobody can actually verify. A third faction blames missing producer credits, late album submissions, unfinished metadata, and other behind-the-scenes technicalities that have absolutely nothing to do with whether a stranger on the internet can post a stolen audio file. Every theory sounds halfway plausible for about 10 seconds. Then reality knocks and the entire structure folds. Because none of these self-appointed analysts have ever sat across from a label executive. None of them have ever negotiated a publishing split. None of them have ever read a real recording contract. They are guessing in public with confidence, and the algorithm is rewarding them for it. Now, let me pull back the curtain on what is actually happening behind the scenes, because once you see this machinery in motion, you can never unsee it. Major labels do not just protect their music. They hunt it. They deploy massive automated detection systems that scan every major platform around the clock, looking for any audio fingerprint, any visual frame, any waveform that matches a song sitting inside their catalog. These systems do not care about your follower count. They do not care about your fan loyalty. They do not care whether you are praising the album or roasting it into oblivion. They detect ownership. They fire the notice. They move on. That is the entire process. And when the artist in question is someone like Drake, an artist whose catalog prints money the way a Federal Reserve building prints currency, that enforcement gets cranked to maximum aggression. Because every unauthorized stream is a leak inside a pipeline worth hundreds of millions. Drake is not being targeted. His catalog is being defended. There is a massive difference, and the people screaming loudest seem completely incapable of recognizing it. Here is where the irony reaches comedic levels. The same fans claiming to defend Drake are doing the one specific thing the industry punishes harder than almost anything else. They are bypassing royalties. Every time a song lives on a platform that cannot monetize it, the entire payment chain shatters. The producer loses out. The engineer loses out. The songwriter loses out. The featured artist loses out. And the artist these fans claim to be protecting, the man whose name is on the album cover, loses out as well. So when these supporters scream that Universal is hurting Drake by yanking down their uploads, they are missing the punchline of the entire decade. The uploads are what hurt Drake. The takedowns are what defend him. Read that sentence twice, because the irony is so layered it almost feels intentional. The fanbase is fighting tooth and nail for the right to steal from their own favorite artist, and they have convinced themselves they are doing it out of love. The dumbest theory floating around right now is the idea that Universal is deliberately choosing to make less money out of spite. Picture that scenario for a moment. A publicly traded corporation, answerable to global shareholders, generating billions every fiscal year, suddenly deciding to torch its own profits to make a political statement against one of its top 3 earners. That is not a strategy. That is not a corporate decision. That is fan fiction written by someone who has never read a quarterly earnings report. Labels do not throw money in the trash for personal vendettas. Labels do not voluntarily shrink their margins. Labels exist for one purpose, and that purpose is to squeeze every measurable fraction of a cent from every commercial corner of their catalog. When the catalog includes Drake, the squeeze becomes ruthless, precisely because the value is enormous. The harder they enforce, the more the asset is worth. That is not a punishment. That is a confirmation of his power inside the building. And while we're on the subject of value, let me drag the absurd $5 billion fantasy into the spotlight. Somewhere in the depths of this fanbase, voices have been screaming that Drake deserves a $5 billion deal in his next round of negotiations. $5 billion. Sit with that number for a second. The artist in question does not own his biggest projects, the records that built his throne, the albums that printed his legacy, the masters that turned his name into a global brand. Those assets are not in his name. They are sealed inside Universal's vault, generating revenue every time someone hits play anywhere in the world. So while the loudest voices online fantasize about a historic payday, the cold mathematics of ownership tell a very different story. His leverage is real. His ownership is fractured. Any executive sitting down to evaluate his actual worth would price in that gap immediately. The $5 billion crowd is not running the numbers. They are running on devotion. And devotion has never balanced a single ledger in the history of the business. There is another layer to this DMCA mess that deserves a microscope because the system is far less sophisticated than the fanbase wants to believe. The enforcement process is not surgical. It is not thoughtful. It is not sitting there reading your caption and weighing whether your tone was respectful enough to spare. It is a machine. A blunt, automated, content-matching machine. It sees the audio. It sees the artist. It sees the ownership flag. It fires the notice. That is the workflow, beginning to end. So when a fan posts a clip from a decade-old Drake song, something completely unrelated to Iceman, and that clip gets pulled, it is not because Universal sat in a meeting and decided to attack that specific narrative. It is because the algorithm does not read narratives. It reads matches. And every match becomes a takedown. The conspiracy crumbles the second you understand the technology powering the system. But facts have a hard time competing with momentum, and the Stand Army is inventing new villains by the minute. One of the wildest claims gaining traction is that Roc Nation is somehow involved in this enforcement campaign. Roc Nation, the management company. As if Jay-Z is locked in a basement somewhere personally directing DMCA strikes against Drake's followers. The mental contortions required to land at that theory deserve their own Olympic event. And yet, the claim spreads, because spreading wild theories generates more engagement than reading a single page about how copyright actually functions. That is the real sickness here. Not sabotage. Not silencing. A fan base that would rather build an imaginary villain than open a single book about the industry they keep lecturing the world about. Now, let me drop you into the part of the story that genuinely changes the temperature of the conversation. The streaming numbers. Because something extremely strange happened during the rollout, and almost nobody outside the industry is connecting the dots. Drake's Day 1 streams came in massive. Headline-grabbing massive. The kind of number that gets framed and hung on a label's wall. But by Day 2, those streams had collapsed by roughly 60%.
60.
That is not a normal cooldown. That is not the natural curve of a major release. That is a freefall that should have alarms blaring inside every analytics room in the industry. The stan community immediately blamed Universal. Then they blamed Spotify. Then they blamed Kendrick Lamar. Then they blamed the algorithm. Then they blamed the moon and the tides. But the more honest observers started whispering a much darker question. What if the Day 1 number was never what it appeared to be in the first place? What if the curve was not collapsing? What if it was correcting? Because here is a detail the stand army cannot afford to acknowledge. Spotify, the biggest streaming platform on the planet, issued a public apology during this exact window. They admitted that streams from 2 separate tracks had been combined incorrectly during a manual review process. They quietly stated that updated review procedures had been implemented. They did not accuse anyone of fraud. They did not point fingers at any specific party. But they acknowledged an inflation that conveniently favored one of the biggest releases in modern memory. And once that correction filtered through the system, the numbers shifted. Not by a sliver. Not by a rounding error. By a landslide. So when fans now scream that Universal is throttling the streams, the colder, harder answer is that the baseline was sitting at an artificially elevated number to begin with. The drop is not sabotage. The drop is gravity finally catching up to a balloon that should have come down a long time ago. And that brings us face to face with the real story buried underneath all the surface drama. Streaming fraud. The phrase nobody in the major label ecosystem wants to say into a live microphone, because saying it out loud is the same as admitting that the modern music economy is sitting on a foundation that shakes every time anyone presses on it. The IFPI, the RIAA, international bodies that exist specifically to protect the industry. They have started openly campaigning against streaming manipulation. They're calling out bots, click farms, hijacked accounts, manipulated playlists, artificial engagement loops. They are publicly admitting that fraudulent streams are pulling revenue away from honest artists. They are acknowledging that the verification systems on these platforms are riddled with weaknesses. They are saying out loud what insiders have been whispering for years. And the timing of this campaign, dropping during one of the most scrutinized release weeks in recent memory, is far too coincidental to ignore. Let me show you something that should send a chill down your spine. There is a small town in Montana called Glendive. The population sits in the low 4-digit range. A blip on the map. The kind of town most Americans cannot find on a globe without help. And yet, for a stretch of time, this microscopic town was somehow generating more streaming activity than entire major metropolitan areas. Glendive showing up as a top market. Glendive ranked number 2 in national streaming data. Glendive appearing again and again in places where its population should have made participation mathematically impossible. The same pattern showed up in a small town in Texas. The same pattern showed up in a handful of other obscure regions scattered across the United States. The data did not add up. The geography did not add up. The math did not add up. And yet, the streams kept rolling in, the charts kept moving, and the headlines kept printing as if the universe was operating normally. Glendive was not an accident. Glendive was a flare in the night sky that the industry chose to look away from for as long as humanly possible. This is the deeper truth lurking behind every layer of the Iceman saga. The fight is not really about whether Universal is helping or harming Drake. The fight is about whether the streaming numbers the public has been digesting for years actually represent real human listening. Because if even a slice of those numbers turns out to be propped up by playlisting deals, autoplay manipulation, banner placements, preferential algorithmic pushes, or outright fraudulent activity, the entire valuation of the streaming economy starts wobbling on its axis. And nobody at the top of the food chain wants that wobble examined under a bright light. Not the labels, not the platforms, not the artists, not the executives, not the analysts who get paid to confirm the narrative. Everyone has a reason to look the other way, and almost everyone does. Think about the bigger picture for a moment. Why does Netflix refuse to release detailed viewership data the way television networks were once forced to? Why does Spotify guard its internal numbers like classified intelligence? Why does every platform preach transparency while delivering the bare minimum required by law? Because if the curtain ever lifts completely, the valuations collapse, the stock prices wobble, the narratives shatter. The carefully manicured illusion built across a decade of streaming dominance suddenly looks like a sandcastle waiting for the next wave. And artists like Drake, whose entire commercial identity is welded to dominating those charts, become the first dominoes to fall when the numbers finally start reflecting reality instead of marketing. So when the stand army screams that Universal is murdering Drake's momentum, they are missing the actual headline by miles. The momentum was never as solid as it looked. The takedowns are not the cause of the decline. The takedowns are protecting whatever genuine revenue still exists on a platform that cannot pay royalties anyway. The real decline is a much darker story about overinflated baselines, manual corrections, manipulated playlist placements, and an entire industry quietly rebalancing its books in real time while the loudest fans on the internet point fingers in every wrong direction. And here is another truth that needs to be spoken plainly. Playlists are not just playlists anymore. They are the new radio. They are the new gatekeepers. They are the deciding factor between a song going platinum and a song dying in obscurity. Landing inside the top 10 of a major playlist can guarantee a track hundreds of thousands of streams before a single organic listener ever discovers it on their own. And when an artist gets removed from those playlists for any reason, whether controversy, contractual disputes, internal politics, or a label power play, their numbers can collapse by 75% overnight. 75%. That is the actual leverage these platforms hold over the entire industry. Not algorithms. Not discovery features. Pure, raw, commercially negotiated placement. And every household name artist you can think of has benefited from that leverage at some point in their career, including the ones currently being defended online as untouchable kings. This is exactly why the streaming fraud conversation matters more right now than at any other point in modern music history. Because if the rules tighten, if verification becomes stricter, if audits become routine, if labels are finally forced to disclose their playlist arrangements the way advertisers are forced to disclose paid promotions, the entire commercial ecosystem of music shifts permanently. Suddenly, the artists who are lifted by inflated baselines have to compete on actual organic engagement. Suddenly, the headlines that announce billion-stream milestones have to be backed by genuine human listening. Suddenly, the carefully maintained illusion of unstoppable commercial dominance gets stress-tested in ways it has never been stress-tested before. And nobody at the top of the mountain, especially not the artists who benefit most from the existing system, wants that stress test to happen on their watch. Yet here we are, watching the cracks split open in real time. A public Spotify apology. A wave of aggressive DMCA enforcement. A 60% day 2 collapse. An IFPI campaign timed perfectly to the moment. A growing list of impossible streaming hotspots scattered across forgotten American towns. A fanbase melting down because their stolen uploads keep disappearing. All of it happening within the same news cycle. All of it pointing toward the same uncomfortable conclusion that almost nobody in the mainstream wants to articulate. The era of unchecked streaming inflation may finally be running out of road. And of course, no Drake story in the current era can exist without Kendrick Lamar's shadow falling across every paragraph. The fanbase keeps insisting they want to enjoy the album in peace. They keep insisting the conversation should stay locked on Iceman. They keep insisting Kendrick is irrelevant to the rollout. And then, within the same breath, they bring his name up again, and again, and again. Strip every Kendrick reference out of the recent body of work and you would be deleting somewhere between 30 and 40% of the lyrical content. That is not a rivalry anymore. That is creative dependency. That is a story arc that refuses to end because it is the only story arc still generating heat. The fans who claim they want to move on are the exact same fans who cannot survive 5 tweets without dragging Kendrick back into the spotlight. There is also a fascinating asymmetry hiding inside this dynamic that deserves attention. Kendrick Lamar's catalog operates under different licensing terms. His music is structured in a way that gives him significantly more flexibility over how it is distributed, marketed, and protected. So when fans ask why his content is not getting hammered with the same DMCA aggression, the answer is not favoritism. The answer is ownership. Real, structural, contractual ownership. The kind of ownership Drake's fanbase loves to scream about in theory but rarely understands in practice. 2 artists, same industry, wildly different control over their own work. And the difference shows up in the enforcement patterns whether anyone wants to admit it or not. The contracts tell the truth even when the fans refuse to listen. This is the real exposé hiding underneath all the timeline noise. It is not about Iceman. It is not about Universal. It is not about whether Drake is being silenced by his own label. It is about how little the average listener actually understands the machinery producing the music they consume every single day. Contracts they have never seen. Distribution agreements they have never read. Licensing structures they have never studied. Royalty splits they could never calculate. Playlist arrangements they have never been shown. Master ownership terms they have never even heard of. And yet, every single day, millions of people argue with full conviction about an industry they have never touched, defending artists they have never met, attacking labels they have never negotiated with, and inventing conspiracies that would not survive a single 5-minute conversation with anyone who actually works inside the building. The truth is uncomfortable, but it is also strangely freeing once you let it land. Universal is not the villain. Universal is the bank. Drake is not being silenced. Drake is being protected, whether his fans recognize the distinction or not. The takedowns are not sabotage. The takedowns are mathematics dressed up as enforcement. The streaming numbers are not pure. The streaming numbers are negotiated, manipulated, and quietly corrected behind closed doors. And the entire narrative being constructed on social media right now is not investigative journalism. It is emotional fanfiction wrapped in a copyright costume. Once you see the architecture of the lie, you can never unsee the layers holding it up. Here is the part that should genuinely make you uncomfortable. The people screaming loudest about this so-called injustice are also the people refusing to engage with any actual evidence. Show them the DMCA documentation, they ignore it. Show them the licensing gap between platforms, they ignore it. Show them the Spotify correction, they ignore it. Show them the IFPI campaign, they ignore it. Show them the Glendive anomaly, they ignore it. Because the goal was never understanding. The goal was always defense. And in an era where defending a narrative generates more engagement than uncovering reality, the entire incentive structure of public conversation has been quietly broken at every level. The loudest voices are no longer trying to find the truth. They are trying to win a battle they cannot even define. There is another disturbing pattern worth pulling into the light. Every time these takedowns happen, the screenshots that flood the timeline are conveniently cropped. Conveniently incomplete. Conveniently missing the original post, the offending audio, the visual content that triggered the strike. The fans share fragments and demand that the world treat those fragments as proof. They omit the actual mechanics of what they uploaded. They edit the evidence before they share it. And then they scream about transparency. The same people demanding accountability from a multinational corporation cannot even practice basic honesty when posting their own grievances. That is not an accident. That is a tactic. A small, dishonest, deeply revealing tactic that exposes more about the fanbase than any DMCA notice ever could. And then there is the matter of those infamous reaction videos. The whitelist ones. The clips that mysteriously stayed monetized for weeks before suddenly getting struck after a 30-day window. Fans are convinced this is proof that the label was lying in wait, planning a coordinated ambush. The reality is far less dramatic. Whitelisting is a temporary administrative status. It does not mean a song is free to use forever. It often means the label is observing engagement patterns before deciding whether to claim, strike, or share revenue. That is not a trap. That is a standard observation phase that every major label uses to evaluate how content is performing across creator ecosystems. The fans interpreted patience as permission. The label was simply taking notes before issuing the bill. There is something almost cinematic about the way the entire industry seems to be holding its breath right now. Because every actor in this story has something massive to lose if the wrong thread gets pulled. The labels lose if streaming fraud becomes a mainstream conversation. The platforms lose if their internal data gets audited by outside parties. The artists at the top lose if their commercial dominance is revealed to be partially manufactured. The fans lose if the heroes they worship turn out to be smaller than the legends they imagined. And the executives behind the curtain lose if the public ever fully understands how the sausage gets made in the modern music economy. Everyone has a stake in keeping the curtain closed. And the curtain is starting to slip. That slip is exactly what the Iceman drama is exposing, even if the people in the middle of it cannot see it. The takedowns are not the story. The takedowns are the symptom. The fan meltdown is not the story. The fan meltdown is the distraction. The Kendrick chatter is not the story. The Kendrick chatter is the smokescreen. The real story is the slow, uncomfortable unraveling of an industry that has been operating on inflated assumptions for so long that nobody inside it remembers what the truth looks like anymore. And when an industry forgets the difference between performance and reality, the correction is rarely gentle when it finally arrives. There is also a quieter consequence brewing in the background that deserves attention. The smaller artists, the independent acts, the bedroom producers, the unsigned writers, the session musicians scraping by on royalty fragments. These are the people who get crushed when streaming fraud goes unchecked, because every fraudulent stream redirects revenue from a shared royalty pool. Every inflated number on a top artist's release shrinks the slice available to everyone else fighting for survival on the same platform. The fans defending unauthorized uploads as harmless fun are unknowingly endorsing a system that quietly bleeds the most vulnerable artists in the entire ecosystem. The injustice is real. It just is not pointed in the direction the timeline thinks it is. And let us not pretend that this is the first time the industry has caught itself in a moment of forced honesty. Streaming farms have been exposed before. Playlisting scandals have surfaced before. Botting operations have been documented before. Each time, the headlines flare up briefly. Each time, the industry promises tighter controls. Each time, the loudest voices move on to the next viral moment, and the underlying mechanics quietly continue operating in the shadows. The cycle repeats because the cycle is profitable. Until the structural incentives change, the surface drama will keep rotating while the deeper machinery keeps grinding through the same patterns. Iceman is not the first chapter of this story. It is just the loudest one this year. The most disturbing realization sitting underneath all of this is that the public has been trained to argue about the wrong things. They argue about chart positions while ignoring how chart positions are calculated. They argue about first-week numbers while ignoring how first-week numbers are inflated. They argue about playlist placements while ignoring who pays for those placements. They argue about ownership while ignoring what ownership actually means in modern contracts. They argue about sabotage while ignoring the basic mechanics of copyright enforcement. The conversation has been engineered to stay shallow because shallow conversations protect deep secrets. And the deeper the secret, the louder the surface noise needs to become. So when you scroll through your timeline and watch another Drake stan scream that Universal is trying to destroy Iceman, remember what you are actually watching. You are not watching a fight between an artist and a label. You are watching a controlled distraction inside a much larger machine. You are watching a fanbase defend a system that is quietly draining the artists they claim to worship. You are watching an entire ecosystem perform outrage while ignoring the genuine cracks forming beneath the surface. You are watching a magic trick where the audience is so focused on the waving hand that they never notice what the other hand is doing. And maybe that is the most haunting takeaway from this entire saga. Not the takedowns. Not the streams. Not the conspiracy theories. The realization that the loudest voices in the room are almost always the most manipulated voices in the room. The realization that emotional defense is the easiest crowd to weaponize. The realization that an industry built on illusion thrives specifically because its most passionate consumers refuse to look behind the curtain. The realization that the truth has been sitting in plain sight the entire time, dressed in the boring language of contracts, DMCAs, royalty splits, and licensing gaps that nobody wants to read. The Iceman situation will eventually fade from the timeline. The takedowns will slow. The fans will move on to the next perceived injustice. The numbers will be quietly adjusted, repackaged, and relaunched as new triumphs. The cycle will reset, the way it always does. But the questions raised this week will not disappear so easily, because once you start seeing the machinery, you cannot unsee it. Once you understand that the streams are negotiated, the placements are paid, the corrections are quiet, and the conspiracies are usually pointed in the wrong direction, the way you experience music online changes forever. And maybe that is the real exposé hiding inside all of this. Not a story about Drake. Not a story about Universal. A story about how the public has been trained to fight loud battles while the real war is being decided in rooms they will never enter. So the next time you see a takedown notice land on a tweet, ask yourself what you are really watching. Is it sabotage? Or is it bookkeeping? Is it silencing? Or is it enforcement? Is it a label attacking an artist? Or is it a system protecting a pipeline? Is it a conspiracy? Or is it a contract being honored exactly the way it was written? Because the answers to those questions reveal far more than any leaked screenshot ever could. And the people who finally start asking those questions are the only ones who will ever understand what is really happening inside the music industry today. Everyone else will keep screaming at shadows. Everyone else will keep defending illusions. Everyone else will keep mistaking noise for truth. And the machine, as always, will keep counting its money while the audience argues about whose name is on the door. The curtain is slipping. The cracks are visible. The questions are louder than they have ever been. And whether the industry admits it or not, the next chapter of the streaming era is going to look very different from the one that just ended. Pay attention to who panics first. Pay attention to who deflects loudest. Pay attention to who suddenly discovers an interest in transparency only after the audits begin. That is where the real story will be hiding. Not in the headlines. Not in the tweets. Not in the takedowns. In the silence of the people who knew, all along, exactly what was happening and chose to say nothing until the floor finally started to give way beneath their feet.